The winter sky over Greenwich Palace hung low and pale, as if the heavens themselves were unsure of the future of the small, flame-haired girl who walked the stone corridors with quiet, measured steps. Elizabeth was still very young, yet she carried in her eyes a wary intelligence that made the courtiers uncomfortable. It was the kind of gaze that suggested she already understood too much about the brittleness of affection in a royal household. Her father, King Henry VIII, visited her rarely in those early years. When he did, his presence filled the rooms like a storm, loud, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Elizabeth felt both awe and fear whenever his shadow crossed the doorway. She longed, in the quiet corners of her heart, for a tenderness she knew he had once shown her mother. But that love had died violently long before Elizabeth could remember it. Even in childhood, she sensed that the palace was a place where love was spoken of loudly but offered sparingly. The courtiers bowed, smiled, gifted her ribbons and silks, but she could see the truth behind their honeyed words. She was a piece on a board, an heir when convenient, a danger when not. At times she wondered whether she belonged to anyone at all. She visited her governess, Lady Bryan, more often than her own father. It was Lady Bryan who brushed Elizabeth's hair, who read her stories, who held her when she woke from nightmares she could not describe. But even that comfort was fragile. Every servant in the palace knew the thin line between favour and disgrace. Anyone could be dismissed overnight, leaving Elizabeth once more with no one to anchor her. Still, she learned early to hold her feelings tightly, the way other children held on to toys. She watched everything. She listened. Whenever she walked through the great halls of Greenwich, she moved with the self-control of someone twice her age, as if she already understood that every step could be judged. But the deepest ache came from her mother's name, whispered only in secret corners. Anne Boleyn, a woman spoken of with equal parts fascination and venom. Some servants crossed themselves at the mention of her. Others lowered their voices, remembering the swift fall of a queen who had once seemed untouchable. Elizabeth learned not to ask about her, though her mother's absence felt like a shadow stitched to her own. One evening, as the wind rattled the shutters, Elizabeth found herself alone in the small private garden where her mother had once walked. She did not know this for certain, but she felt it, an instinct, a quiet pull. The bare branches swayed, their silhouettes thin and trembling against the sky. Elizabeth pressed her hand to the cold stone of the wall and imagined a woman with dark, searching eyes walking here before her. A woman who, despite everything said about her, had loved her daughter fiercely. For reasons she could not explain, tears pricked her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, angry with herself for such weakness. Princesses were not supposed to cry, especially princesses whose futures depended on appearing stronger than they felt. Footsteps sounded behind her. It was her half-brother Edward, still younger than she, wrapped in thick furs. He smiled shyly. He was the only member of her family with whom she felt something close to affection. They spoke in soft voices, the way children discuss secrets not meant for the world. Edward told her about his lessons, about the tutors who praised him excessively. Elizabeth listened, nodding, although she knew she would never receive such admiration. She was clever, perhaps more clever than any of them, but her birth, her mother, stood between her and the warmth of pride. Edward reached out and handed her a small wooden toy, carved into the shape of a lion. "You should keep it," he said. "It looks like you." She laughed lightly. "A lion? Why?" "Because it watches everything," he replied. "And it looks like it never forgets." Elizabeth closed her fingers around the toy, feeling the smoothness of the wood. She wondered if Edward knew how true his words were. The moment was brief, as all tender moments in her childhood seemed to be, cut short by the sharp voice of a chamberlain calling Edward away. He hurried back toward the palace, leaving Elizabeth standing alone beneath the darkening sky. That night she lay awake in her small chamber while the wind howled outside. She held the lion tightly against her chest. In the glow of the dying fire she whispered to herself, not a prayer exactly, but a promise. She would learn. She would watch. She would endure. If love would not come to her freely, she would forge something stronger than love. She would build a future where no one could decide her worth but herself. She did not yet know how cold and treacherous that path would become. She did not know the betrayals, imprisonments, and heartbreak waiting for her beyond childhood's thin walls. But on that winter night in Greenwich Palace, with the wooden lion in her hands, Elizabeth Tudor took her first step toward the steel that would one day define her reign. The years that followed tested Elizabeth in ways she could not have imagined in her girlhood. The glitter of courtly admiration dimmed as the weight of a crown settled upon her shoulders. She was no longer simply Elizabeth Tudor, a clever young woman navigating the treacherous politics of her family. She had become Elizabeth, Queen of England. Every glance was now a question, every gesture a message, and every whisper a judgment. Power, she quickly learned, was a lonely inheritance. Yet even a queen's heart could tremble. Among the men who surrounded her in those early years, few stirred her spirit like Robert Dudley. He had been her childhood companion, someone who understood the shadows of the Tudor court because he had lived through them as she had. When they spoke, she felt for the first time since her father's death that she could breathe freely. His laughter softened her anxieties, and his presence steadied her in a world that had long felt unstable. But the world around them was merciless. Court rumours grew, spreading like ink across parchment. Ministers raised eyebrows, foreign ambassadors sent home embellished stories, and even members of her council whispered anxiously. The Queen, they said, was too fond of Robert, too trusting, too close, and Robert himself was not free. His wife's existence turned every glance between them into political fire. Elizabeth knew all of this. She had been shaped by such dangers from childhood. She had seen what love, or the appearance of it, could do to a woman in her family. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had paid for the king's changing affections with her life. Her stepmother, Catherine Howard, had suffered a similar fate. Elizabeth had grown up with the painful lesson that desire, if mishandled, could destroy a woman entirely. Still, her heart betrayed her. There were moments, quiet and fleeting when the court had gone to sleep and the torches burned low, that she found herself thinking of Robert in ways she dared not speak. In those silent hours, she questioned whether a queen could ever be simply a woman, someone who longed for companionship, for understanding, for a love that was not tangled in politics and suspicion. But dawn always silenced those thoughts. In the bright, cold light of day, she became the queen again, calm, sharp, and unwavering. She reminded herself that England had placed its future into her hands. Her people looked to her for strength, stability, and independence. She could not let personal longing cloud her duty. "I must remain whole," she whispered to herself more than once. "For my people, I must remain whole." Still, Robert's presence made that vow tremble. When he entered a room, she felt it. When he spoke, she listened more closely than she intended. And when he smiled, that rare, sincere smile that reached his eyes, her carefully built composure cracked just enough for her to feel the ache beneath. Their bond deepened in unspoken ways, but it also attracted peril. Advisers pressed her to marry a foreign prince, urging alliances through matrimony. Parliament demanded she secure the succession through heirs. Some even warned of civil unrest if she refused. Elizabeth responded to them all with the same poised defiance. She would marry when she chose, and only for England's good. But in the hidden corners of her heart, the truth whispered painfully. The one man she might have chosen could never be hers. The tension between duty and desire grew heavier with each passing season, and yet, through all the whispers and warnings, Robert remained by her side, loyal, devoted, and perhaps burdened by the same impossible longing. As the years unfolded, Elizabeth learned that the throne granted her authority over millions, but denied her the simplest freedoms. She could command armies, change laws, and shape the future of nations, yet she could not claim the happiness she quietly yearned for. And in that contradiction, her heart grew both stronger and more fragile. The world saw the glittering Queen of England poised and magnificent, but within, Elizabeth lived in a constant storm, one where love, loyalty, and sacrifice battled endlessly, shaping the woman she was still becoming. Elizabeth had grown accustomed to the weight of her crown, yet some burdens never grew lighter. As the years passed, her beauty softened, her steps slowed, but her mind remained as sharp as any blade in England. Still, The one thing she could not outwit was time and the quiet ache she carried in her heart. Robert Dudley's presence at court had become a memory wrapped in sunlight and sorrow. He had died suddenly years earlier, leaving behind a letter that Elizabeth kept locked in a small jewelled box near her bedside. She never showed it to anyone. Only God knew how often she opened that box at night, reading his words again and again as if they might warm the cold corners of her solitude. And yet, despite the loneliness, Elizabeth continued ruling with iron discipline and an unwavering dedication. Foreign ambassadors still feared her intellect. Her counsel still depended on her steady hand. She was the Virgin Queen, a symbol of strength for her people. But even symbols grew tired. One rainy evening, as the palace lanterns flickered, Elizabeth walked through the long gallery, her skirts brushing softly against the polished floor. She paused before a portrait of Henry VIII, her father. His expression was stern, unyielding, carved in that familiar mask of royal pride. She stared at it for a long moment. "I have done all this," she whispered, "without becoming you." But she also knew she'd inherited more from him than her red hair and sharp tongue. She'd inherited his loneliness, the loneliness of rulers who could never fully belong to anyone. Her thoughts drifted next to Anne Boleyn, her mother, whom she had known only through stories and blurred memories. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, she imagined what her mother might have said to her if she had lived long enough to see Elizabeth crowned. She imagined gentle advice, warm hands, maybe even pride. But such dreams were delicate things, too fragile to hold for long. As she walked on, the corridors felt heavier, as though stuffed with ghosts of the past, her family, her lost loves, her sacrificed youth. Later that night, Elizabeth returned to her private chamber. A fire crackled faintly. The wind pressed against the windows like a restless messenger. She sat at her writing desk, dipping her quill into ink, and began to write not a proclamation, not a letter to a foreign throne, but a private confession. She wrote of the choices she had made, the refusal to marry, the alliances she had built with words rather than vows, the way she had loved and lost Robert Dudley, the way she had carried England in the empty place where her own family should have been. As she wrote, tears gathered in her eyes, not dramatic sobs, but quiet, tired tears that slipped down her cheeks and dotted the parchment. They were tears for the girl she once was, for the woman she had become, and for the life she had never been able to live. When she finished the letter, she folded it carefully. She did not seal it. She placed it in the same jewelled box that held Robert's last message, as though the two letters belonged beside each other, a small reunion of the only people who had ever truly known her heart. In the final years of her life, Elizabeth spent more time in contemplation. She still held audiences, still made decisions, still protected her country with unwavering resolve. But at night, when the palace fell silent, she allowed herself to think not of empires, but of what-ifs. What if her mother had lived? What if her father had loved differently? What if she'd married Robert? What if she'd allowed herself to be simply a woman, not a monarch? The world would never know, and neither would she. One spring morning, when the court gathered for what they believed would be a routine audience, Elizabeth did not rise. Her ladies found her sitting upright in her chair, wrapped in heavy robes, her face serene, her eyes half closed, as though listening to something far beyond the room. Beside her bed, on a small table, the jewelled box lay open. Inside were 2 letters, her own and Robert Dudley's, the quiet testimony of a queen who had given everything to her country, even the life she might have lived for herself. England mourned her deeply, for she had ruled longer and steadier than anyone had expected. But in the silent heart of her story, hidden behind the grandeur of the crown, remained the truth she had carried all her life. A daughter shaped by loss, a woman sustained by unspoken love, and a queen who chose duty over her own longing. And though history would call her Gloriana, Good Queen Bess, and the Virgin Queen, those titles captured only the surface of her life. Beneath them lived a woman whose greatest victories had come through sacrifice, and whose greatest love had never truly left her.